Hi, my name's Furst, and today I'd like to talk to you about one of the most important figures in the history of gaming. Without him, the NES may never have even been sold in North America, and believe it or not, that isn't anywhere near his undoubtedly greatest achievement. I'm talking about the legendary Gunpei Yokoi. Gunpei Yokoi was born in Kyoto, Japan on September 10th, 1941. Not much else is known about his early life, but around 1965 he was hired by a small playing card company called Nintendo. His first position with the company was working as a maintenance engineer at one of their many Hanafuda manufacturing plants. In other, less flattering words, Yokoi was the guy who made sure that the factory was running smoothly, who fixed defective machinery and replaced belts if they broke. It wasn't exactly a glamorous profession. But Yokoi was a smart man and a self-fashioned inventor. He liked toys and loved making them, tinkering with his ideas during breaks or after work. One such idea eventually evolved into this extending arm, which Yokoi dubbed the Ultra Hand, a contraption he built in his spare time for nothing more than his own amusement. While visiting the factory that Yokoi helped maintain, Hiroshi Yamauchi, then president of Nintendo, took notice of the Ultra Hand. Yamauchi had long wished to grow Nintendo into something more than a mere playing card company, resulting in some very weird Nintendo-branded businesses and products, but that's another story for another day. Impressed by Yokoi and his knick-knack, Yamauchi promoted him and gave him the resources he needed to turn the Ultra Hand into a real product. And when it was put on the market, it became an astronomical success, selling well over 1 million units. With this success under his belt, Yokoi was moved to the newly created Games and Toys division at Nintendo, given his own team, later dubbed R&D 1, and told to develop other ideas for toys that Nintendo could sell. While none of them were ever quite as big as the Ultra Hand, some, like the 10 Billion Barrel, Love Tester, Ultra Machine, and a Light Gun, were at the very least modestly successful. Now, you can probably guess where this is going. In the early 70s, arcades started popping up all over Japan and North America, and just like a lot of other companies, Nintendo decided to dip their toe into this new and emerging market. In 1974, Nintendo partnered with Magnavox to distribute their Odyssey system, the first gaming console ever made, in Japan, and in 1975, they released EVR Racer, their very first arcade machine, which was developed by Genyo Takeda, their first official game designer. Mr. Takeda was the only person who preceded Gunpei Yokoi as a video game designer at Nintendo, but Yokoi's work with arcade cabinets is not what we're here to really talk about. In 1979, while traveling on the Shinkansen, Yokoi spotted a fellow businessman playing with the buttons on an electronic calculator. I'm sure anyone who's owned a TI-83 in high school knows that feeling. This simple sight, a man fiddling with a calculator to kill time, had a real impact on Yokoi. He loved the idea of a watch with a game in it. It sowed the seed of an idea that, down the line, would grow to become his greatest contribution to the gaming industry, but that wasn't for many years to come. Back in 1980, the very first generation of this watch with a game in it blossomed into the very aptly named Game & Watch series of handhelds, which you should recognize for one reason or another. Despite being very primitive by today's standards, and though they were not the very first handheld games to be released, the Game & Watch franchise was one of the very first to gain real, tangible, worldwide success. The line lasted for nearly 10 years and sold a cumulative 40 million units, and gave Nintendo a very strong foothold in the industry that would become their bread and butter. But all wasn't well for the fledgling game maker. They were still having trouble breaking into the arcade business in North America. In very late 1979, Nintendo released an arcade game called Radar Scope to incredible success in Japan, where it was second in popularity only to Pac-Man for some time. However, you could only really call it a small success in the North American market, and even that is being very kind to the game. Nintendo sunk a lot of money into Radar Scope, but there was a large surplus of machines sitting unsold in a warehouse, and the game's failure threatened to sink the entire company. They needed something really big to keep them afloat. At this point, now with the Game & Watch on his resume, Yokoi was one of the main creative personalities driving Nintendo. He was a clever man who always kept his promises, and from the hearsay I've been able to pick up from the internet, he really had Yamauchi's ear. He would often listen to Yokoi's ideas and follow his advice or suggestions. So, naturally, in 1981, Yamauchi approached Yokoi and asked him to supervise a project underway from one of Nintendo's programmers, a fresh-faced young man named Shigeru Miyamoto. The plan was simple but daring. Take the unsold machines and convert them into a new game to be sold. Radar Scope was the very first game Miyamoto had worked on, and he claims that he was only chosen for this project because he was the only person available. Regardless of the circumstances, the game that he designed and Yokoi supervised turned out to be Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong?
Which was released in 1981 and was exactly the game that Nintendo needed it to be. In its first 2 years on the market, it made $280 million, which adjusted for inflation is roughly $650 million in 2014 money. Wow! The game pretty much single-handedly saved Nintendo, but it brought something infinitely more valuable than money to the company. It created a strong friendship between Yokoi and Miyamoto, who Yokoi took under his wing as an apprentice. Miyamoto would later become the face of Nintendo and create many of their truly iconic characters. Nintendo had a new franchise on its hands, and they wanted to fully capitalize on it. So Yokoi started to work on a Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong, but he realized that there wasn't a great way to control the constant back and forth movements of Jumpman. So he had to make one. This led him to create one of his biggest contributions to gaming. And if you have ever picked up a console controller, I can guarantee that you've used it. I'm talking about the D-pad. Precursors to this invention existed in games like Gremlin's Blockade or SNK's Vanguard, but how we know and think of the D-pad today was designed entirely by Yokoi. Originally, Yokoi had intended for it to just be used in handheld games like Game & Watch. But when Nintendo decided to move into the home video game market, the company's higher-ups decided that the design would be a great addition to the family computer system they'd been developing. So, when they launched the Famicom in Japan in 1983, its controllers all used the D-pad as the standard way of moving the player character. However, Nintendo faced a problem when trying to release the console in North America. See, in 1983, the North American console market crashed due to a large volume of, frankly, low-quality consoles, each flooded with shovelware. When Nintendo approached retailers at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1985 with their Americanized Famicom, dubbed the Advanced Video System, nobody wanted to touch it. They claimed that gaming consoles were a joke,
Oh yes, sirree!
and no one would actually buy one. And focus group testing proved them right. So, Nintendo had to be really clever with how they sold the machine. They rebranded the console into the Nintendo Entertainment System, and packaged it with the NES Zapper and Rob the Robot. The former of which was based on Yokoi's old light gun design, and the latter of which was straight up designed by Yokoi. They used New York City as a test market, and sold the NES not as a gaming console, but as a centerpiece for entertainment. Basically, when retailers said they weren't interested in a game console, they said, "What? No! This isn't a gaming console. It's a toy. Look, you got Rob the Robot. It's a toy." Of course, we already know the end of this story. The NES was released in October 1985 and was a huge success, selling nearly 62 million units worldwide and 34 million units in North America alone. It pretty much single-handedly cast a phoenix down on the North American console market and made way for all the games that we love and play today. Now, I've noticed that a lot of people never seem to put this together, so I really want you to think about this for a second. Yokoi had a pretty direct hand in both the NES Zapper and in Rob the Robot, both of which were instrumental in getting the NES onto store shelves in North America. So I think it's fair to say that Yokoi played at least a small part in getting gaming back into the American living room. I'm not saying that the market would have never recovered without him, but things probably wouldn't have gone as quickly or as smoothly without Yokoi's help. This, in my opinion, is reason enough to respect the man and his accomplishments, but believe it or not, we're not anywhere close to his greatest achievement. During the NES's life cycle, Yokoi was a very busy man, overseeing his own team, the aforementioned R&D1, and producing a multitude of fantastic titles like Duck Hunt, Metroid, Kid Icarus, Fire Emblem, Donkey Kong Jr., and Dr. Mario, just to name a few. But in the back of his mind, his thoughts always kept wandering back to that fateful day on the Shinkansen in 1979, when he saw that businessman playing with the calculator. The Game & Watch was a hit, and with the success of the NES, Yokoi wanted to marry the two ideas, to get the NES into the palm of your hands. He started tinkering with the idea of a portable console in early 1987, and later that year he approached Mr. Yamauchi with a prototype that he'd developed. Yamauchi absolutely loved it, and put the project into full production, speculating that the device could sell 25 million units in 3 years. The president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, however, had much grander plans for the handheld system. He believed that they could break 100 million units, but only if they sold it with the right software, in the same way that they'd sold Super Mario Bros. With the NES. In July of 1988, Arakawa found exactly what he was looking for: Tetris. It was fun to play, easy to design, and was already fairly popular. Nintendo secured the rights to the game, and Yokoi oversaw development of a version for his handheld. And in 1979, the Game Boy, bundled with Tetris, was released in Japan and North America. Now, Yokoi and his Game Boy weren't the only players in the portable gaming market. Around the same time, Sega released their Game Gear, and Atari had the Lynx out on store shelves. There is no doubt that both of those systems were clearly superior technologically, but they missed something that Yokoi understood from the very beginning. In pretty much everything he designed, Yokoi used a philosophy he called lateral thinking with withered technology. Basically, he knew that the most important thing to most customers was that a game or a toy or a console was 1, fun, and 2, cheap. So instead of finding and using the most cutting-edge technology, Yokoi looked for new ways to use older, proven, and inexpensive technologies to make fun gameplay. Sound familiar? When he introduced this idea to others at Nintendo, that shit ran deep, and his apprentices within the company still design their games and hardware using this doctrine.
Simply beefing up those graphics will not let most of us see a difference. I suppose I could give you a list of our technical specs. I believe you'd like that. But I won't, for a simple reason. They really don't matter.
Sometimes it's worked out really well for them. Other times, not so much. One time it really worked was with the Game Boy. Atari and Sega did not understand this. And while their systems are very cool and look really good, their battery life and price tag suffered for it. The Game Boy may not have had the best tech or looked the greatest, but it had what really mattered: a long battery life and a library of kick-ass games like Pokemon, Tetris, and Super Mario Land, the latter of which Yokoi helped design. Needless to say, the Game Boy changed everything and was a worldwide success, selling roughly 120 million units during its lifetime, and the line just kept growing and growing. An adapter called the Super Game Boy was put into stores in 1994, and it let gamers play their Game Boy games on their televisions through their Super NES. In 1996, an ergonomic, redesigned unit was released called the Game Boy Pocket, and a backlit version of the system called the Game Boy Light was released exclusively in Japan in 1998. In that same year, a major graphical and mechanical upgrade to the system was released in the Game Boy Color, which allowed for games to be played in 8-bit color instead of black and grayish-green monochrome. Yokoi and his system were on top of the world, but the man and his mind kept working on new ideas. He garnered a fascination with 3D and the idea of totally immersing a player into a game, an idea we call virtual reality or VR in the modern market. While other teams at Nintendo started to work on 64-bit gaming or a more advanced version of the Game Boy, Yokoi threw himself and his team headfirst into this VR venture. However, the project, dubbed the Virtual Boy, was plagued with problems from its very inception. To prevent the system from becoming impossibly expensive, a color display was simply out of the question. So Yokoi settled on red LEDs because they were the cheapest available and gave the games a unique look. Problems with the 3D display were numerous, and the system had to compromise and use a form of parallax scrolling instead of true 3D. The headset wasn't portable because it was attached to a tabletop, and it wasn't really a home system because you couldn't really use it comfortably. All in all, the Virtual Boy was just a complete disaster. There wasn't really anything redeeming about it outside of its really cool and ambitious concept, and it sold very poorly as a result of that, moving less than 1 million units total. It is undoubtedly Nintendo's greatest failure, and is really the only blemish on Gunpei Yokoi's career. To be fair to Yokoi and his Virtual Boy, the idea was very far ahead of its time. Just look at where the industry is headed now. We have real, workable, glasses-free 3D with the 3DS, and we're all waited on bated breath for the Oculus Rift, and Sony just announced their own VR headset in Project Morpheus. The Virtual Boy's problem was that its design didn't follow Yokoi's own philosophy. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't fun to play with, and it didn't even sacrifice those things to look good. Apparently, Yokoi knew that the Virtual Boy wasn't ready, and never intended to release it in its lackluster form. But he was forced to because Nintendo focused all of their resources onto their N64 system. Despite his previous successes, and despite everything he'd done for Nintendo, and gaming in general, Yokoi took the fall for the Virtual Boy's failure. He lost almost all of his clout with Nintendo, and though they never fired him, he was removed from any position of real power, and basically given busy work to occupy his time. Corporate Japan is brutal in this respect. Now, if there's anything you can say about Gunpei Yokoi, it's that he's a creative man. So he didn't last very long in his new position. In 1996, after 31 years with Nintendo, Yokoi resigned from his position and left the company. Now, Nintendo has claimed that the Virtual Boy had nothing to do with Yokoi's departure, saying, quote, "It is reality that Mr. Yokoi has indeed left, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the failure of the Virtual Boy. There's no doubt that the Virtual Boy was a failure, but the head of the company himself has said that the blame for that rests on the decision to sell it to begin with. The D-pad and the Game Boy that Mr. Yokoi developed are incredible. Such a man taking the blame for the 32-bit device and leaving the company is completely made up." But between you and me, and take this with a grain of salt because it is only the intuition of a very seasoned people watcher, but they're completely full of shit. Yokoi was invaluable to the company for nearly 3 decades, creating 2 of the most successful lines of handhelds of all time. They wouldn't just let a man like that slip away if they didn't really blame him for their biggest failure ever. Really, the only thing I can say about this is that it's just sad. Imagine what Yokoi could have done with the company had he stayed on through the late 90s and through the 2000s. After he left Nintendo, Yokoi did what he'd been doing all of his life. He kept making games. Not long after his resignation, he started his own gaming company called Kodo. No, not that type of Kodo. And developed a system for Bandai called the Wonder Swan. Though this might not have been the fate he'd hoped for himself, things were starting to look up again for Gunpei Yokoi. But then, tragedy. On October 4th, 1997, Yokoi was traveling along the Hokuriku Expressway with a Nintendo businessman named Etsuo Kisu when he rear-ended a truck. The pair exited their vehicle to assess the damages of the crash and to talk with the other driver when they were both struck by 2 other vehicles. Mr. Kisu fortunately escaped with only a few broken bones, but Yokoi was crushed in the second accident. He passed away 2 hours later in a nearby hospital. I was not personally cognizant of the gaming industry when Yokoi passed away, so I can't really give you a first-hand account of the community's reaction to his death. I wish I could. I wish I could find an internet archive or a forum or something chronicling it, but it was 1997 after all. There isn't really one. I can, however, dispel some rumors commonly associated with his death. Sorry guys, I love a good conspiracy theory as much as the next schmuck, but the Yakuza and Mr. Yamauchi had nothing to do with this unfortunate accident. So, Internet, I implore you to stop spreading silly stories about his death. And I also ask you not to be saddened about his passing. That's not why I made this tribute to the man. Instead, let's celebrate his life, and his work, and the happiness that he brought to millions of people. Gunpei Yokoi may no longer be with us, but his enormous legacy, all the amazing contributions he's made to this art form that we call gaming, lives on in his work, and in his apprentices, and in every controller and handheld that we pick up. If you were not aware of Mr. Yokoi before this video, I hope that you now appreciate what he's done for us as gamers, and to you, Mr. Yokoi, wherever you may be in this universe or the next, please accept this most sincere of thanks from a little boy who grew up playing your games. Thank you.
For lifetime achievement.
If my father were able to attend the ceremony, the joy that I could feel as his son would have been something no words of mine could ever express. To him, and thank my Father in heaven, to whom I have an ever-increasing feeling of love and respect.
Thank you.